Welcome back to part 3 of video 8, English syllable stress, rhythm, and timing. So once again, the kind of prototypical rhythm of an English utterance is da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. We have unstresses and we have stresses, and they fall into a pattern contrasting with each other. So if we examine the 3 major stress or beats in these sentences, we have go, go, store, went, Markham, and fair. I'm going to go to the store, I'm going to go to the store, I'm going to go to the store, I went to the Markham Fair, I went to the Markham Fair, I went to the Markham Fair. And we can hear this contrast between the function words and the content words. As we said before, the amount of time it will take to say each sentence depends not on the number of syllables, but on the number of stresses. Take a minute and count the syllables in the following sentences, and then determine which are the content words and where the stresses are on the content words. Alright, so you should have noticed that there are varying numbers of syllables, but there are 2 content words in each sentence, and each of those content words will of course have a major stress. So each of these sentences would take the same amount of time to say and have the same rhythm pattern. Listen to me say them. The bananas are rotten, it's excessively expensive, the coffee is delicious, I've explained enough. Listen again. The bananas are rotten, it's excessively expensive, the coffee is delicious, I've explained enough. We can see all the rules we've been talking about coming into play on these sentences. Again, we can take any 2 sentences and count the number of syllables and stresses and compare the amount of time it would normally take. Here are 2 sentences that have similar numbers of stresses but different numbers of syllables. Primarily, again, because the first one is a very heavy sentence with a lot of content, and the second one includes a lot of grammar, given that it's a conditional sentence. So number 1, Mike sold 2 really big houses last week. And number 2, I think that he could have sold a lot more if he'd had the funds to do some more advertising. My students have always loved to look at these rhythm pyramids. I first saw a rhythm pyramid in Avery and Ehrlich's Teaching American English Pronunciation textbook, or maybe even before that, because I think one of them were a guest speaker. One of them was a guest speaker at the University of Toronto when I did my TESOL certificate. So let's have a look at these pyramids, and I'd like you to repeat after me, banging on the desk if it doesn't bother you or anyone else. So kids, kids like candy, the kids like candy, the kids like the candy, the kids will like the candy, the kids will like the candy. You can see that no matter how many function words we add, we only add a beat when we add a content word, so the 2 bolded sentences end up having the exact same beat pattern and taking the same amount of time. Let's do it again. Kids, kids like candy, the kids like candy, the kids like the candy, the kids like the candy, the kids like the candy. And yes, your students will say that you're cheating because you're reducing the function or grammar words in the last sentence so much, but it's not cheating if everybody understands what I say. So we're going to use what's called an articulatory loop method, and that is moving something from the short-term memory to the long-term memory, working for retention and hoping for carryover into spontaneous use. So in order to move something from the short-term memory to the long-term memory, it has to have less than 7 parts. That's why the typical telephone number has no more than 7 parts after the area code. And you need to have it repeated to you or to repeat it yourself, both preferably in pronunciation, at least 3 times, and 7 would be better. And you need to exaggerate the characteristics of the component as you try to move it into long-term memory. Always aim for target words that are really salient, and at the lower levels things that are really clearly universal concepts and easy to imagine. So coffee, coffee, coffee. After 3 times a student may be able to repeat after me. Vomit, vomit, vomit. But if I keep working through that articulatory loop a few more times, they're going to be much more able to pronounce after me. It's really important as well as having the acoustic cue of the articulatory loop method and a visual cue of highlighting the features that you're trying to work with, to use movement in the pronunciation class. Pronunciation is a physical skill. Coaching and practice are necessary for change in adulthood. Muscles have to be developed, thousands of practices per sound really before it comes naturally, and the motions are internalized more quickly if exaggerated, and physical movement makes the stress, for example the syllable stress very tangible. So for the syllable stress, I'll often use an elastic band, and each student will hold one and pull it out. For example, imagine saying elastic, pulling out the elastic on the second syllable. I'll also use tapping, elastic, elastic, elastic. Nodding, you can't see me doing it, but I'm nodding my head on the second syllable of elastic, 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 elastic. And you can also use gesturing. I'm moving my hand now, again you can't see it, but try it yourself, moving my hand on the second syllable, elastic, elastic, elastic. You'll see that each technique gives you a slightly different feel for the pronunciation, so make sure that you vary between all four of those techniques of adding movement. So let's look at some of the methods we can use to increase carryover, because many teachers have told me they are trying and trying to teach pronunciation, but their students are not changing their pronunciation. They come back in the next day using their old patterns of pronunciation. So how can we increase carryover? As I said, the physical aspect is very important. You can use stretching, banging, nodding, gesturing, or conducting motions. This is pretty much a repetition, so I'm not going to repeat everything here, and I'll move on to the next slide. Sorry about that. In addition to the physical aspects, there are the mental or cognitive aspects of increasing carryover. Syllable stress is a new theory for many students. Theoretical handouts and information is highly valued by some learners, depending on their learning style and their educational background. The use of a system to represent the level of stress, ratios, the 3, 1, 2, X's, dots, font size, those are also very helpful in keeping the concept in mind. Give lots of data, contextualized data, and examples for analysis and comparison. In addition to the physical and the cognitive or mental aspects, we have the emotional aspects of pronunciation, and we can add those to increase carryover. People don't feel comfortable making new sounds. We need to ensure that there is an all for one and one for all attitude in the classroom. You need to demand full participation. You need to make sure that everybody's on board, doing the choral repetitions, doing the elastic bands, all of those things. Use a lot of choral repetitions so people can hide within the crowd. You can't sing against a choir, so people are much more likely to be on target. And then you cannot produce phobias because they're not easy to reverse. So use these things to help with the emotional aspects. There are a number of psychological factors that can impede carryover or help to increase it. If you start to recognize in the classroom and work with the ideas that language, personality, and culture are closely intertwined and impact on the type of pronunciation an individual or a cultural group will feel comfortable with, that's really helpful. Individuals may find it upsetting, painful, and unnecessary to allow them to really sound English. They only want to sound comprehensible. So don't work for a perfect target or some preconceived notion of what English needs to sound like. However, the brain does not like to aim for imperfect imitation, and people will find within the choral repetition that they will be moving towards pronouncing things like the target does. But you have to, maybe especially because of that, allow the individual in class to continually renegotiate the desired outcomes for the pronunciation. And then always take into account the sociological aspects that can impede or increase carryover. Deciding to take on a new pronunciation is tied to decisions about membership. Who do we want to sound like? Definitely the males in the class may not want to sound like a female teacher and vice versa. The younger students may not like to sound like someone middle-aged like myself. So there are all kinds of questions of membership. There's a big question of who to imitate and who is available to imitate. There are gender, status, profession, etc. issues that are all concepts that are all sub-issues as well. So think about those things when you're asking people to imitate a particular model, and provide a lot of different contexts within which to practice various sentences. So if you look at all of the issues we just talked about and all of the concepts that are involved in pronunciation, it can begin to seem like quite a daunting task to help someone to say a sentence like the one that's in front of us right now on this slide. But imagine not being able to say such a sentence. I mean, I'm able to turn to you if you're a new colleague in my workplace and say really comfortably, do you want to grab a cup of coffee? And I'd be pretty sure in my pronunciation that you would understand that I was being friendly and inviting you, and there was no pressure, and that you could refuse, but then I'm hoping that you wouldn't, and if you did refuse, you'd make an excuse and hopefully would have coffee coffee later. So much is included then in my utterance of this statement. But what's involved in pronunciation? I have to locate, first of all, the appropriate grammar for this function, this invitation. I have to locate the content words, the stressed syllable on coffee, decide what intonation pattern. Here I'm going to have a high rise at the end. So many things involved, but I think you can start to imagine that the more time we spend on pronunciation and helping people to sound the way they want to sound, to do the functions they need to do, the more wonderful it will be for students going forward. So listen to the way that I do say this. Do you want to grab a cup of coffee? Do you want to grab a cup of coffee? Do you want to grab a cup of coffee? Want, grab, cup, coffee contribute to the rhythm of the sentence. So we've looked at syllable stress, we've looked at rhythm, we've looked at timing.